No election ever put them in office. No constitution limits their reach. And yet, their decisions can lift entire nations into prosperity or quietly push them toward collapse. They don't rule countries. They shape outcomes. This is the hidden world of the power brokers, the individuals and institutions that sit between capital, policy, and global influence. They rarely appear on ballots, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In currency crises, debt restructurings, trade agreements, sanctions, and the sudden reversals of national fortune. To understand who really decides which nations rise or fall, we have to stop looking at presidents and start following the leverage. Power has always existed beyond borders. In the age of empires, it wore uniforms and flew flags. Control was visible, violent, and unmistakable. But after the devastation of 2 world wars, something changed. Military conquest became costly, politically risky, and economically inefficient. A new system emerged, one built not on occupation, but on integration. Institutions replaced armies. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 laid the foundation. The world's financial architecture was redesigned. Currencies were pegged to the US dollar, which was pegged to gold. Capital flows were structured. Stability became the official goal, but influence was the quiet result. Out of this system rose a new class of actors: central bankers, financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, credit rating agencies, multinational corporations, and international lenders. Individually, they seemed technical, almost bureaucratic. Collectively, they became decisive, because in the modern world, nations don't fall from invasion. They fall from imbalance. Think about it. Debt that grows faster than productivity. Currencies that lose credibility. National budgets that depend on external confidence. And confidence is not democratic. It is granted. In the decades that followed World War II, countries learned an uncomfortable truth. Access to capital often mattered more than ideology. A nation could have resources, a brilliant population, and incredible ambition. But without approval from these financial gatekeepers, progress stalled. Loans came with conditions. Foreign aid came with demands for reform. Investment came with expectations. And these expectations reshaped economies from the inside out. Subsidies were removed. State-owned assets were privatized. Labor markets were liberalized. Trade barriers were torn down. In theory, all of this was meant to create efficiency and growth. In practice, the outcomes varied wildly. Some nations adapted and thrived, becoming the Asian tigers or other economic miracles. Others fractured. Their societies buckled under the strain of rapid externally imposed change. The difference was rarely cultural or moral. It was structural. Power brokers didn't design policies for societies. They designed them for systems. Balance sheets mattered more than ballots. The stability of the global financial system mattered more than social equity within a single country. And when instability appeared, the response was swift and decisive. Capital exited. Credit dried up. Ratings agencies issued downgrades, currency pressure mounted. Suddenly, democratically elected governments faced impossible choices: slash spending on schools and hospitals, or lose access to the global financial system. Reform now, or default later. This wasn't coercion by force, it was coercion by math. The 1980s debt crises across Latin America made this painfully clear. So did the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, and the sovereign debt collapses in Europe just a decade ago. Different regions, different decades, but the same underlying pattern. Nations rose when their policies aligned with the expectations of global capital. They fell when that trust vanished. And trust was not evenly distributed. So national leaders learned to speak a new language, the language of markets. They talked about growth projections, fiscal discipline, structural reforms, and investor sentiment. Those who spoke it fluently gained favor. Those who resisted, or even just hesitated, paid a heavy price. But the power brokers themselves remained largely invisible to the public. They didn't govern directly, they advised. They evaluated, they rated, they financed, and sometimes they withdrew. In doing so, they shaped national trajectories more reliably than any election cycle ever could. The most unsettling part: they were rarely wrong from a purely financial perspective. they were just indifferent. Their mandate wasn't to create prosperity for everyone. It was to maintain the stability of the system. And in a deeply unequal world, stability for the system often comes at someone else's expense. As globalization deepened, this quiet architecture of power expanded. Capital moved faster than ever before. Supply chains stretched across the entire globe. Financial shocks could travel from one continent to another almost instantly. The room for national error shrank to virtually zero. By the early 21st century, a nation's fate could change overnight, triggered not by a war, but by a shift in sentiment thousands of miles away. A single meeting in a boardroom, a new report from an analyst, a one-notch credit downgrade, a rise or fall followed. And yet, this isn't a simple story of villains pulling strings. It's a story of systems and who gets to design them. These institutions and the rules they enforce were created to solve real problems, to prevent the kind of economic chaos that led to global conflict. But systems have unintended consequences. They create their own logic. To truly understand how this power works, we have to look closer. We have to examine the specific moments when this influence became undeniable, the crises that pulled back the curtain and revealed the brokers operating behind the scenes. We need to explore the mechanics of a currency attack, the politics of a sovereign bailout, and the hidden leverage in a trade negotiation. Because power that operates without visibility is the most effective kind. And once you see the architecture of that power, you can never unsee it. Power rarely announces itself with uniforms or flags. More often, it arrives quietly through contracts, balance sheets, interest rates, and emergency meetings held behind closed doors. By the mid-20th century, the very architecture of global power had changed shape. Empires no longer needed colonies when they could influence currencies, trade flows, and debt. After World War II, much of the world lay in ruins. Europe's cities were rubble. Asia was exhausted. And into that vacuum stepped a new kind of power broker, not kings or generals, but institutions. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 didn't look dramatic. There was no battlefield, no surrender. Just a group of economists, politicians, and bankers gathered in a quiet hotel in New Hampshire. Yet what they created would shape the fate of nations for generations to come. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, a new global financial system, with the US dollar at its center. On paper, the goal was stability. The plan was to prevent another Great Depression, to avoid devastating currency wars, and to rebuild shattered economies. For a while, it worked incredibly well. Western Europe rose again from the ashes. Japan transformed into an industrial giant. Global growth surged. But embedded deep inside this new system was a hidden hierarchy. Some countries would write the rules, and others would be forced to follow them. Voting power inside these new global institutions directly reflected economic weight, which meant the United States and its allies held disproportionate influence. Loans from the IMF and World Bank came with conditions, and those conditions shaped national policy. And that policy, in turn, shaped the lives of millions of people. For developing nations, access to capital became both a lifeline and a leash. In the 1970s and 80s, many countries across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia borrowed heavily to modernize their economies. They built roads, factories, and power plants. The future looked promising until global interest rates suddenly skyrocketed. All at once, their national debt exploded. What followed was not just an economic crisis, but a political one. Governments faced an impossible choice: default on their loans and face complete international isolation, or accept rescue packages tied to incredibly strict reforms. These reforms had a name: structural adjustment programs. They demanded the privatization of state-owned assets, massive cuts to public spending, deregulation of key industries, and sweeping trade liberalization. The logic was clean and simple. Markets would fix inefficiency. Growth would return. Debt would shrink. But the reality on the ground was far, far messier. Hospitals lost their funding. Education budgets were slashed. Food subsidies disappeared almost overnight. Local industries, which had served their communities for generations, collapsed under a wave of competition from foreign corporations with much deeper pockets. On the balance sheets of international banks, the numbers improved. But in neighborhoods and villages around the world, suffering deepened. This wasn't always a result of malice. Often, it was driven by ideology, an unwavering belief that free markets, when applied universally, would lift all boats. But the very same policy can have radically different effects depending on where it lands. A nation with strong, stable institutions can absorb an economic shock. A nation without them simply fractures, and fractures create opportunity. While governments struggled to stay afloat, multinational corporations expanded their reach. Deals for resource extraction were signed at massive discounts. Strategic infrastructure quietly shifted into private hands. Ports, mines, telecom networks assets that were once owned by the public were sold off, changing ownership with little fanfare. Power was no longer seized by force, it was acquired through finance. At the same time, a parallel system of influence was growing, one that was less visible, but equally potent: credit rating agencies. A single downgrade from an agency like Moody's or Standard & Poor's could raise a country's borrowing costs overnight. A negative outlook could scare off foreign investors before any crisis had even begun. These agencies insisted they were just neutral observers, simply providing analysis. But their judgments carried immense consequences, and were often shaped by the very same economic philosophy embedded in the DNA of global finance. For a nation trying to chart an independent path, any deviation from the accepted rules was punished swiftly. By the 1990s, globalization accelerated everything. Capital could now cross borders in seconds. Factories could be moved to wherever labor was cheapest. Supply chains stretched across continents, and countries found themselves competing, not just for economic growth, but for approval. Approval from the markets, approval from the lenders, approval from the very institutions that defined what sound policy was supposed to look like. Some nations learned to play this game very well. South Korea, Taiwan, and later China used a strategy of selective openness, embracing global trade while maintaining strong state control over their economies. They borrowed lessons from the West without surrendering their sovereignty. They rose. Others weren't so lucky. Russia's transition after the fall of the Soviet Union became a stark cautionary tale. A campaign of rapid privatization, which was advised and applauded by Western institutions, ended up concentrating the nation's wealth into the hands of a few. A new class of oligarchs emerged. The state's capacity to function collapsed. Life expectancy for ordinary people fell dramatically. An entire generation felt betrayed by a system that had promised freedom but delivered chaos. And from that chaos, a new political reality was formed, one shaped by resentment, nationalism, and a deep, abiding mistrust of global elites. Because when people lose control over their economic future, they inevitably search for someone to blame. By the early 21st century, the power brokers were no longer just institutions. They were networks, investment banks that could move entire markets with a single memo, hedge funds that could bet against the economies of whole countries, tech platforms that controlled the flow of information for billions of people, energy cartels that could tilt the balance of geopolitics with their production decisions. Power had become diffuse, scattered, but it was no less real. And then came 2008. The global financial crisis exposed a brutal irony. The very system that had disciplined poorer nations for fiscal irresponsibility nearly collapsed. Due to a culture of excessive risk-taking at its own core, banks were bailed out. Trillions of dollars were mobilized overnight. The rules were bent because, for the powerful, they had to be. For many people watching from the outside, the message was unmistakable. There were rules for some, and then there were exceptions for others. Trust fractured. The rise of populism, the eruption of trade wars, and the return of fierce geopolitical rivalry didn't emerge from a vacuum. They were reactions to decades of imbalance, of critical decisions being made far away from the people who would ultimately bear their cost. Yet even now, this system persists. Because so far, no clear alternative has managed to fully replace it. The question today is no longer whether these powerful brokers exist. We know they do. The question is whether nations can still rise without submitting entirely to their rules, and whether, in a world this interconnected, true independence is still possible at all. Power, once it's out in the open, rarely just disappears. It adapts. It changes its shape. By the 2010s, the world had entered a new era. This wasn't a time defined by the unstoppable march of globalization, but by its limits. The supply chains that once promised ultimate efficiency suddenly revealed their fragility. The financial systems we built on confidence proved to be dangerously vulnerable to panic. And the very same forces that lifted entire nations up could just as easily pull them right back down. The power brokers were still there, of course. They always are, but their faces were changing. China's rise forced a fundamental recalibration of the global order. Unlike previous emerging powers, China didn't just slot itself into the existing system. It selectively began to reshape it. State-owned banks started financing massive infrastructure projects all across Asia, Africa, and even Europe. Ports, railways, energy grids capital was now flowing not just from Washington or Brussels, but from Beijing. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just an economic project. It was leverage, layered into concrete and steel. Supporters hailed it as a new era of development. Critics called it debt trap diplomacy. But for many countries, it was the only capital they could get fast, without strings attached, and politically flexible. And with every loan, influence followed. Meanwhile, the traditional institutions were facing a crisis of legitimacy. The IMF and the World Bank tried to adapt. They reformed their language, softened their conditions, and even acknowledged some of their past mistakes. But trust, once you lose it, is incredibly slow to return. Nations started looking for alternatives: regional banks, bilateral deals, powerful sovereign wealth funds. Power was fracturing into competing blocks. At the same time, a quieter, almost invisible force was reshaping the very idea of sovereignty: technology. Control over data became control over populations. Algorithms started to influence elections. Social media platforms shaped public narratives. Surveillance tools blurred the line between national security and state dominance. The companies that built this new infrastructure weren't states, but their reach began to rival that of governments. For the first time in history, power brokers didn't need territory. They needed servers. And then came the shocks. The pandemic froze the global economy overnight. Governments printed money at a scale we had never seen before. Central banks became the last line of defense, not just for the markets, but for social stability itself. Interest rates dropped to almost zero. Debt soared, and once again, inequality widened. Those who already had assets grew richer, or those without fell further and further behind. Then, inflation returned. And with it, the old familiar mechanics of power kicked back in. Interest rate hikes by the major central banks punished debt-heavy nations first. Capital fled to safety, currencies collapsed, the prices of food and fuel surged, protests followed, governments fell. The pattern was familiar because the underlying system hadn't really changed, only the players had. Today, the fate of a nation is shaped by a convergence of powerful forces: financial markets, geopolitical alliances, technological control, and resource security. There's no single institution that decides who rises or who falls. But together, these forces create a kind of gravity that very few can escape. Some countries are learning how to maneuver within this new reality. They're diversifying their partners, investing in their own people, and protecting their most strategic industries. They aren't rejecting the system outright. They're learning how to bend it to their advantage. Others, however, miscalculate. History shows us that collapse is rarely sudden. It's a gradual process. It's invisible at first. A missed opportunity here, a growing dependency there. It continues slowly, quietly, until one day, the margin for error completely disappears. And when that crisis finally hits, the power brokers return not with armies, but with terms and conditions. This is the great paradox of modern power. It claims to be neutral, efficient, inevitable, yet it reflects a specific set of values, interests, and hierarchies that were shaped by history. Nations don't rise or fall because of destiny alone. They rise or fall by the deals they sign, the debts they accept, and the systems they choose to trust. So the real question isn't whether power brokers decide the future. They do. The real question is whether nations understand the game early enough to play it on their own terms. Because in the modern world, sovereignty isn't taken from you in a single, dramatic moment. It's slowly negotiated away, piece by piece, deal by deal. And only those who recognize that truth stand a chance of keeping it. Thanks for watching. If you found this insightful, consider subscribing for more deep dives into how our world works.